picture the scene. It's August 9th, 1974.
Mm-hmm.
A man steps onto a green Marine One helicopter right there in the White House lawn. He turns around, he flashes this double V for victory sign with a really rigid smile, and then he flies away from the most powerful office on Earth in absolute disgrace.
Right.
Richard Nixon is the only U.S. president to ever resign. But, I mean, the wildest part of this whole picture, the man flying away in shame, is the exact same man who created the Environmental Protection Agency, ended the military draft, and fundamentally reshapes the entire global order.
It is, well, it's the absolute definition of a historical contradiction. When you dive into the comprehensive dossier you've shared with us for today's deep dive, the traditional narratives just totally fall apart. You really cannot paint this administration with a single brush.
No, you can't. And welcome to today's deep dive, by the way. Our mission today is to take this massive stack of research and unpack how one single administration could be, so strategically brilliant, push these surprisingly progressive domestic policies, and yet simultaneously engineer its own spectacular, unprecedented destruction.
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack.
It really is. We're looking at a legacy that is, honestly, the ultimate American political paradox. So to understand how this all ends with that helicopter ride, I think we have to look at the absolute powder keg that birthed his presidency.
Oh, absolutely. The context of the 1968 election is crucial here. The country was essentially tearing itself apart. I mean, you have massive, visceral national unrest.
Right.
The tragic assassinations of Martin Luther King Jr. and Robert F. Kennedy happened within months of each other.
Right.
There are massive anti-Vietnam War protests filling the streets. And of course, you have the incredibly violent, chaotic Democratic National Convention in Chicago.
Which was broadcast right into living rooms across the country.
Exactly. The whole nation just felt like it was fracturing.
And in the middle of all that fire and noise, Nixon steps up. And he positions himself as the ultimate law and order candidate. He appeals directly to what he famously coined the silent majority.
Mm-hmm.
He's talking to socially conservative Americans who were completely alarmed by the 1960s counterculture, the anti-war demonstrations. He promises a return to stability, and, well, it works. He wins the White House.
He wins by promising traditionalism. But the dossier reveals the first massive paradox of his tenure, which is his actual domestic agenda.
Yeah.
He runs as a staunch conservative, but once he's actually sitting in the Oval Office, he enacts some of the most sweeping liberal policies in modern American history.
Okay, let's unpack this, because the sheer volume of these policies is staggering. I mean, he establishes the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, and OSHA, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration.
Oh.
And then there's the Family Assistance Plan, or FAP. And this wasn't just like a minor tax credit. He was literally proposing a guaranteed minimum income of $1,600 a year for a family of 4. He was pushing for universal basic income in the early 1970s.
It's wild.
Yeah.
And you have to add his civil rights record to that list, which is something that frequently catches people off guard.
Oh, definitely.
The Nixon administration implemented the Philadelphia Plan. And this wasn't just a suggestion. It was the nation's first functional affirmative action program. It mandated that government contractors hire a minimum number of minority workers.
Wow.
Furthermore, his administration successfully executed the desegregation of Southern schools. By September 1970, the number of black children in the South attending completely segregated schools had dropped to less than 10%.
It's basically like, okay, imagine a strict traditionalist CEO being hired specifically to crack down on a rebellious startup. But the moment he takes the corner office, he unexpectedly doubles the budget for the art department, implements a progressive wellness program, and totally diversifies the board.
That's a great way to put it.
But I have to ask, based on the research, did Nixon actually believe in any of these progressive policies? Or was he just, tossing massive legislative bones to the Democratic-controlled Congress so they'd leave him alone?
What's fascinating here is the sheer, unadulterated pragmatism of his approach. Nixon was not an ideological crusader on the domestic front at all. The sources include a highly revealing memo he wrote to his top aides in 1970.
Okay.
He explicitly told them that when it came to most domestic areas, and I'm quoting here, "I am only interested when we make a major breakthrough or have a major failure. Otherwise, don't bother me."
Don't bother me. That is incredible. He's the president of the United States.
I know, right? But he wanted his desk completely clear of local disputes. He championed a concept called New Federalism,
Right.
which was essentially a mechanism to shift federal power and funds back to state and local governments. He figured if he handed the states the money and let his cabinet manage the day-to-day progressive expansions, like signing the Clean Air Act, for example, he could just buy political peace.
So he could focus on other things.
Exactly. He essentially outsourced his domestic presidency because his eyes were locked on a map of the world.
It's wild to think he outsourced the home front, but you start to understand why when you look at the powdercade he inherited globally. Because Nixon wanted domestic issues off his desk, he poured his real energy into the global chessboard. We move from his pragmatic domestic compromises to his radical, world-altering foreign policy. This is where his true ambitions lay.
They really did. And his foreign policy required an entirely new framework, which became known as the Nixon Doctrine. The mechanism here was a massive pivot. Instead of the U.S. military acting as the direct shield for all free nations, which is, how we ended up with 500,000 troops bogged down in Vietnam, the U.S. would transition to providing indirect military and economic aid.
So, changing the strategy completely.
Yes. We would arm our allies, but expect them to supply the manpower for their own defense.
Which brings us directly to Vietnamization. He starts drawing down U.S. troops, bringing American soldiers home, and eventually ends the military draft entirely. He shifts us to the all-volunteer force we have today.
Exactly.
But while he's publicly pulling troops out of Vietnam, he's secretly expanding the war geographically. He authorizes Operation Menu.
Yeah, and Operation Menu was a covert, devastating carpet bombing campaign in neutral Cambodia, along with authorized incursions into Laos. It was a dual-track mechanism.
Right, because he wanted out, but...
All right, Nixon wanted to withdraw American forces, but he absolutely refused to let it look like an American defeat. By secretly bombing supply lines in Cambodia, he was trying to choke off the North Vietnamese and force them to the negotiating table.
But the domestic reaction when that Cambodian expansion became public was completely explosive. It triggered massive nationwide protests.
You did.
Which led directly to the tragic Kent State shootings, where 4 unarmed college students were killed by the Ohio National Guard. It was tearing the country apart all over again.
It was incredibly bleak. But while Southeast Asia was burning, Nixon and his national security advisor, Henry Kissinger, were orchestrating a diplomatic maneuver that would completely alter the Cold War.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting. The 1972 visit to China. It is almost impossible to overstate how shocking this was to the global system. The U.S. hadn't formally recognized the Communist government of China for over 2 decades.
Not since 1949.
Right. And then suddenly, Nixon is flying into Beijing. He walks down the steps of Air Force One and just extends his hand to Premier Zhu Enlai.
That specific handshake is a masterclass in diplomatic symbolism. Back in 1954, at the Geneva Conference, the U.S. Secretary of State, John Foster Dulles, had pointedly, publicly, refused to shake Zhu Enlai's hand.
Oh, wow. So it was a known slight.
It was a massive insult.
Yeah.
So Nixon, extending his hand the moment he stepped off the plane, was a calculated mechanical resetting of global relations.
And it birthed the whole Nixon goes to China phenomenon in politics, right?
Yeah.
The idea that only a famously rigid, hardline, anti-communist like Richard Nixon could actually make peace with a communist regime.
Exactly.
Because if a liberal president had tried it, they would have been crucified for being soft on communism.
No.
But Nixon had the conservative credentials to pull it off.
Precisely. And the mechanics behind setting it up were pure spycraft.
Yeah.
Henry Kissinger literally faked a stomachache during a trip to Pakistan.
Wait, really? A stomachache?
Yes. Just so he could disappear from the press and take a secret, covert flight to Beijing to lay the groundwork. By formally opening relations with China, Nixon and Kissinger were actively exploiting a growing ideological fracture between Communist China and the Communist Soviet Union.
It's basically a massive geopolitical love triangle. I mean, Nixon starts flirting heavily with China. He's going to the Great Wall, having these prime-time televised banquets specifically to make the Soviet Union jealous and nervous. They were playing them off each other.
And Moscow panicked exactly as intended. The Soviets were absolutely terrified of the Sino-American alliance. So, just months after the China trip, the Soviets suddenly become very eager to host Nixon at the 1972 Moscow summit.
Right.
And this leads directly to the era of détente.
Détente meaning a cooling off, right?
A cooling off, yes. But more importantly, a functional freezing of the arms race. They codify this in the landmark Salsai Treaty, the Strategic Arms Limitation Talks, and the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty.
Which was huge.
It was. The mechanism here was simple. Neither the U.S. nor the Soviets wanted to bankrupt their economies building endless thousands of nukes. Nixon's China pivot forced the Soviets to agree to legally cap their nuclear arsenals, significantly de-escalating the existential threat to the planet.
Okay, but I have to push back here on this idea of Nixon as this heroic global peacemaker. The dossier also details deep CIA involvement in Latin America, specifically the Track I and Track II operations in Chile.
Right.
These were aimed at overthrowing their democratically elected Marxist president Salvador Allende. Considering the brutal realities of the secret Cambodia bombings and the operations in Chile, was Nixon's strategy actually about bringing peace with honor, or was it just a cynical, ruthless game of realpolitik?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, Nixon and Kissinger viewed the global chessboard in a strictly multipolar, realist way. Morality was secondary to leverage.
Right.
Track 2 wasn't just a vague memo. It was a direct authorization to the CIA to, as Nixon famously and coldly put it, make the economy scream in Chile.
Wow, make the economy scream.
Yeah. They intentionally cut off international credit to destabilize the country and spark a military coup. They achieved monumental de-escalation of the Cold War, yes, but the research clearly documents that this came with severe, documented humanitarian costs globally.
So you have a president who has just completely restructured the global order. He's opened China, he's negotiated with the Soviets, he's secured massive domestic wins. You would think a guy with that resume would feel incredibly secure.
You would think so, yeah.
But instead, that culture of extreme secrecy and ruthlessness he cultivated in his foreign policy bled directly into domestic paranoia. And that sets the stage for his downfall.
It really is the transition from brilliant global mastermind to petty domestic paranoid. That's the true tragedy of his administration. Let's look at the sheer numbers of the 1972 election. Nixon is riding incredibly high on his diplomatic victories.
He absolutely demolishes his Democratic opponent, George McGovern. It is a historic landslide. I mean, Nixon takes 61% of the popular vote. He wins an astounding 520 electoral votes to McGovern's 17. He won 49 out of 50 states. It was a total blowout.
It was a blowout. But behind the scenes of that inevitable crushing victory, a deeply toxic culture was festering. You had his campaign organization, the Committee for the Re-election of the President.
Right, which was unfortunately but accurately acronymed CRP or CREEP.
Exactly. And within CREEP, there was a covert operations group known as the Plumbers.
They were called the Plumbers because they were originally formed to fix leaks, right? Like when the Pentagon Papers were leaked to the press.
Exactly. But this group, which was populated by former CIA and FBI operatives like E. Howard Hunt and G. Gordon Liddy, they transitioned from plugging information leaks to running aggressive illegal espionage operations against Nixon's political rivals.
Which is crazy.
And this entire toxic culture culminates in June 1972. 5 burglars connected to the campaign are arrested trying to bug the Democratic National Committee headquarters at the Watergate office complex.
Which makes absolutely no logical sense. It's like a marathon runner who is already 5 miles ahead of the competition, guaranteed to win the gold medal, but he still secretly hires goons to slash the other runner's tires.
That's a good analogy.
It was wildly unnecessary. If Nixon was guaranteed to win 49 states, why on earth risk the entire presidency on something as petty and pointless as bugging a Democratic office? Especially using former CIA guys who somehow bungle taping a door latch.
Because it was never about the polling data. It was about the deeply ingrained psychology of the administration. While historians still debate whether Nixon micromanaged or explicitly ordered that specific braid-in beforehand, he unequivocally fostered an environment of absolute ruthlessness.
Right, the culture came from the top.
Yes. He maintained literal enemies, lists of journalists, politicians, and celebrities. He viewed politics not as a democratic contest, but as a total war for survival.
And where does that level of paranoia come from?
You have to look at his history. After losing the presidency by a razor-thin margin to JFK in 1960, and then suffering a humiliating defeat when he ran for governor of California in 1962, he felt the media and the political establishment were actively conspiring to destroy him.
Ah, I see.
Think back to his infamous 1962 press conference, where he lashed out at reporters, declaring you won't have Nixon to kick around anymore.
Right.
That trauma birthed a drive to not just beat his opponents, but to utterly crush them. That bunker mindset became his Achilles heel.
And that unnecessary tire slashing didn't just cause a flat tire, it totaled the entire car. Because as the sources show, it wasn't the burglary itself that immediately sank Nixon. It was the relentless, desperate, mechanical effort to cover it up.
The cover-up is always the fatal flaw. The administration immediately went into damage control. They arranged to pay hundreds of thousands of dollars in hush money to the burglars to buy their silence.
Oh.
They pressured the FBI to back off the investigation. But the mechanism of a cover-up is fragile, and the truth started leaking out. The turning point was when White House counsel John Dean realized he was being set up as the fall guy.
Right, he flips.
He flipped. He went to the Senate investigators, and he testified that the president was deeply involved in the cover-up.
But even then, it was essentially John Dean's word against the President of the United States, until the ultimate bombshell drops. During the televised Senate Watergate hearings, an aide named Alexander Butterfield is asked a direct question, and he reveals that Nixon had a secret, voice-activated taping system installed in the Oval Office.
Yeah.
Everything was recorded.
And that revelation fundamentally changes the trajectory of American history. Suddenly, there is objective, incontrovertible truth available. The special prosecutor investigating Watergate, Archibald Cox, immediately subpoenas those tapes.
Of course.
But Nixon absolutely refuses to hand them over, citing executive privilege. And this standoff leads directly to the infamous Saturday Night Massacre in October 1973.
Let's break down the mechanics of the massacre, because it's wild. Nixon decides he's just going to fire the special prosecutor, but he can't do it directly.
No, he can't.
He orders his Attorney General, Elliot Richardson, to fire Cox. Richardson refuses to do something so blatantly corrupt and resigns.
Right.
So Nixon goes to the Deputy Attorney General, William Ruckelshaus, and orders him to fire Cox. Ruckelshaus also refuses and resigns. He finally has to get the Solicitor General, Robert Bork, to pull the trigger and fire Cox.
It was chaos, and the public outcry to that chain of events was deafening. The American people watched a president basically decapitate his own Justice Department to protect himself.
Yeah.
This leads to the surreal era of Nixon going on national television, physically tense, famously telling the country, "I'm not a crook." He eventually agrees to release some edited transcripts and tapes, but then there's the bizarre 18.5-minute gap on a crucial recording.
The famous gap. His loyal secretary, Rosemary Woods, claims she accidentally erased it while transcribing. She demonstrated this physical gymnastics routine for the press, the Rosemary stretch.
The stretch, yeah.
Where she claimed she had one foot on a pedal and her hand reaching awkwardly across the desk to answer a phone, simultaneously erasing the tape. Nobody bought it.
No, nobody bought it. The walls were completely closing in. Finally, the Supreme Court steps in and rules unanimously that Nixon cannot use executive privilege to hide evidence of a crime. He must hand over the unedited tapes.
Yeah, there it is.
Right. And sitting right there on those unedited reels is the smoking gun. It was a recording from June 23, 1972, just days after the break-in. On the tape, you can hear Nixon explicitly agreeing to a plan to have the CIA falsely tell the FBI that the Watergate break-in was a national security operation, forcing the FBI to back off.
It was undeniable, recorded proof of obstruction of justice. So what does this all mean? When you look at it, the tragic irony is just suffocating. Nixon installed those secret audio tapes because he wanted to preserve the legacy of his brilliant strategies. He wanted historians to hear his genius in real time. Instead, they became the exact literal receipts used to destroy him. But let me ask you, could Nixon have survived the scandal if he had simply dragged a trash can into the Oval Office and burned the tapes early on, before the subpoenas really locked him in? Or was the momentum of the investigations already too much to stop?
This raises an important question about the structural rule of law. If he had burned the tapes early on, it certainly would have created a constitutional crisis of a different flavor, the outright destruction of evidence.
Right, which is bad.
Very bad. But legally speaking, without the physical tapes, it would have remained his word against the word of his aides. The political reality, however, is that the smoking gun tape removed every shadow of a doubt. Once that tape was released, his political support evaporated overnight.
Wow.
On August 7, 1974, a delegation of Republican congressional leaders walked into the Oval Office and bluntly told him he had maybe 15 supporters left in the entire Senate. Impeachment in the House and conviction in the Senate were absolute certainties.
So, facing the inevitable, on August 9th, 1974, he resigns. And his vice president, Gerald Ford, takes the oath of office and declares to the country, our long national nightmare is over.
It ended the Nixon presidency. But the ripple effect of that nightmare and the institutions he built are still very much with us today.
Which brings us to why you, the listener, should care about this deep dive. Nixon's presidency isn't just a dusty history lesson. It is the ultimate masterclass in the duality of leadership.
Absolutely.
Think about the world you interact with every day. The water you drink and the air you breathe are protected by the EPA that Nixon created. The geopolitical landscape, particularly modern U.S.-China relations and arms control, exists entirely on the foundation he built.
Yet at the exact same time, you live in a political climate defined by the post-Watergate era.
Yeah.
The deep, pervasive mistrust of government institutions, the skepticism of executive power, the adversarial, combative relationship between politicians and the media that is equally Richard Nixon's enduring legacy.
It leaves us with a final, lingering concept to chew on as we wrap up today's deep dive. If a leader achieves monumental, world-improving policy successes, but commits fundamental breaches of democratic trust and the rule of law, how should history weigh those scales? Can undeniable political brilliance ever truly offset a poisoned moral root, or does the character of the leader ultimately define everything they touch? It's something to think about the next time you see a politician trying to fit into a neat little box because, as we've learned today, the reality of power is infinitely more messy.